Now, as promised, we've got some expert analysis on China's new leadership and the challenges it is facing. Joining me now is James Corbett, an editor of the alternative news portal Corbett Report. Thank you very much for joining us. Firstly, if I could ask you that the country's economy is slowing after what is called China's economic miracle, isn't it? Will the new generation of politicians manage, do you think, to get it back to the speed that it was?
Well, that's a very good question, and whether or not that is the case, I think China is on track to overtake the U.S. economy as the world's largest economy sometime within the next 4 years. It's now projected to overtake. So I think whether or not they're able to get it on the same blistering course that they were in the past, I think there is now such institutional investment in the economic infrastructure that's been created around China in the past few years that I think a lot of players at the table are really invested in the idea of China continuing to grow. And we see this now with people scrutinizing the latest manufacturing data out of China very closely. And if it was true in years past that if the U.S. sneezed, the rest of the world caught a cold, I think it's now becoming true in the Chinese situation. So I think there's going to be, even if China is not able to maintain its blistering pace of growth, it is still going to continue to grow because there's a lot of investment simply hinging on that idea.
Now let's just talk about the military, because despite the current slowdown, it has increased military spending by a double-digit amount, hasn't it? So do you think it's trying to assert itself militarily?
There's no question that there's been a very concerted effort to build up the Chinese military and naval capacity in the past few years, and we've been seeing that playing out and being utilized more in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. I think that that's almost guaranteed to continue, and we're seeing, for example, the deployment of new drones, new aircraft carrier, lots of new technology that they have are developing right now that is certainly not at any point, at this point, certainly not a rival to American military dominance in the region. But one could imagine that extending from here and to see it becoming a real military power. And I think there's no question that that's where the Chinese leadership wants to take China.
Right, well, let's move on to the US now, because the US has confirmed that it's shifting its priorities to Asia in what has been dubbed the Asia pivot. How do you expect China to respond to that?
Well, I think we've already seen how this is starting to play out with the confrontation, for example, between China and Japan over the Senkaku Islands, and we've seen some indications of how this is going to happen through U.S. proxies in the region rather than a direct confrontation between the U.S. and China. And I think that plays into everyone's interests at the moment, because no one is really that interested in upsetting the entire table at this point in time. I think that's something that could potentially develop some ways down the road. And I think that's what China has their eye on at the moment, and that's why they're steadily and quietly just continuing to build up their military forces. But again, I think there's a lot of economic and financial interest that's been invested in this, in the relations between China and the U.S. and China and Europe. So to whatever extent that there may be military tension between the two powers, I don't think it's in either of their interests at this point to actually start a confrontation.
Well, China is taking a tough stance, isn't it, on territorial disputes at the moment with Japan and the Philippines. So is this a direct response to US military build-up in the region, do you think?
I think it has to be seen as just part of, not necessarily a response and not necessarily a provocation, but just part of what happens when we have these big actors that are increasingly becoming bigger, that are in this close proximity. So I think that there's going to be a lot of quote-unquote solutions being offered by things like the International Crisis Group that wants to see an expanded ASEAN, which of course is just going to be a type of U.S. bulwark against Chinese hegemony in the region, versus China, which is going to continue to seek its right to assert itself in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. And as I say, I think there will be a confrontation some ways down the road. But until that point, I think that there's going to be a lot of economic and financial turnover in the world economy that's going to be hinging on China, that will probably be playing more of a role, including the upcoming BRICS summit in Durban, South Africa later this month, that I think is going to play a potentially a pivotal role in changing some of the global financial infrastructure.
James, thank you for your thoughts. We do have to leave it there. That is James Corbett, editor of the Corbett Report.